Should be. All right, cool. Hey folks, Nick Taylor here from Forum. Forum's a software that powers dev. I am not on the dev stream today. I'm on my own stream, twitch.tv/NickyTOnline. I'm here with a friend from my virtual coffee group, Kirk. Kirk, you want to say hey and maybe a bit about yourself?
Yeah, hey everybody, my name's Kirk. I am a full stack software developer in the Caribbean. I'm also like slightly obsessed with functional programming, and I use my friends as guinea pigs so they can learn all about it, and I can get them to just do that all the time and join me. So that is why Nick is here today.
Cool. So, uh, we're going to talk about Elm today. Elm is I'll let you go into the explanation of it, but from what I know, it's would you call it a front end framework or a front end library or just a language?
Um, Elm is a functional programming language that was designed specifically to work on like front end development.
Okay.
I think that's the front. I'm sure there's people in the Elm community who probably have like a better explanation of it, but that's how I see it in my head. Like it's a full part, you can do whatever you want with it,
Okay.
but like it is sort of like optimized for front end development. Elm compiles to JavaScript, and Elm was basically designed by somebody who is a front end developer and was like, oh, I think this can solve a lot of issues that folks have when they're trying to make safe applications.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of how it came to be. Elm is also a purely functional language, which I think is like important to highlight. Um, Pure scripts, for those who are familiar with pure script, I haven't heard that name in a while, but for those who are familiar with pure script like has a similar paradigm.
Okay.
Listen, there's a time like there's been a lot of scripts over the last like I would say 10 years. We were talking about like CoffeeScript a couple days ago, and I like CoffeeScript was like had this big bloom, and then like it kind of tapered off a little bit. And
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure.
there's a lot of scripts on there.
Ah,
Yeah, but Elm sort of tries to do two things. It's like one, okay, we're going to do this the purely functional way, but also we're trying to make it in a way that's accessible to people, so it's super easy for them to dive in and get to like just working on projects. Which is why we're here to see how well that kind of works.
cool, cool, cool. So it's a language. It's would you say it's strongly typed?
Yes, it's absolutely strongly typed. So okay, so maybe we should sort of like take a step back and talk a little bit like what does being a functional programming language mean? I think one of the unfortunate things about the term is that the word functional has like 17 different contexts. So it's like, what does that actually mean?
Okay.
Especially like being purely functional. So in general, you can split modern programming languages into three paradigms. There's a lot of different splits, but one axis you can use is object-oriented languages, where you find things like classes and inheritance. Functional languages have no concept of classes. Uh, they are expression-based versus like imperative. It's like when we think of programming, we typically think of a series of actions that you tell the computer to take.
Okay.
And functional languages tend to think of it instead as like expressions that need to be answered, sort of like the way you used to do in your math class. Like, so every part of the code is basically like an equation, and running the code is basically like, okay, variable goes in, and that equation is executed, and something comes out.
Yeah.
And then you have languages that are multi-paradigm, which have elements of functional programming and object-oriented programming, JavaScript, Python, TypeScript, all being sort of multi-paradigm.
Okay. And uh, for those who might be new to functional programming, functional programming, you end up with things being idempotent all the time, meaning like whatever you put in,
Yes.
you always get the same result back.
Yeah, so there's this concept of a pure function, and that's exactly what it is. A pure function says for the same input, I will give you back the same output every time. and I have no side effects. So I can't like also do an HTTP request, or I can't just like also print something to console. Like I just
Yeah.
the internals of the function do not touch the rest of the program. And Elm is like sort of one of the most strict on that, and like that's pretty much the entire application.
Cool.
Um, if you want to do well, we'll see how you can get into like doing um, those types of effects, which like it's for those of you who are used to React and a sort of like state and effect paradigm, it's like a very similar thing.
Okay.
So in Elm, like there are very specific ways to manipulate state. Most of the functions you write cannot manipulate the state, and there's like a very specific ways to inject effects in Elm. In fact, one of the interesting things, I don't know if you saw that recent package breach where they found out that somebody was cloning private package libraries
Okay.
to get like private companies when they were doing their updates. Like npm would default to the public library, so it's like if you could guess the name of a private package, you can make a fake one on the npm
Oh yeah,
registry.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe not npm, yeah. So that whole thing. But like Elm packages with the latest version, they can't have stateful effects either. So like any Elm package that you import is guaranteed to just be pure stateless like Elm functions and Elm data types. So like they can't do any rogue HTTP, they can't do any rogue fetches, like no, like they can't do any of that.
Okay.
Elm is one of the most like secure in terms of that structure. There's no such thing as like, oh, some rogue JavaScript I didn't know about being executed,
Okay. Uh,
which is cool.
I'll stop you for one sec. I'm not ignoring you when you see me turning like that. It's because when I stream, I have the chat open over here, and there's already somebody in the chat,
Yeah,
and I tweeted it out, so I check on the Twitter too. So it's not me being like, Kirk's being so boring. I'm gonna go watch cat videos on YouTube. So, um,
I mean, we could also just do that.
yeah, I guess we could
Yeah.
stream cat videos. Yeah, people would do that. Yeah, no, so this is cool. So, and I'm trying to remember the history of this because we don't have the link right now. We'll try and find it, but you did a brown bag on Elm on our in our virtual coffee group, which we both attend, virtualcoffee.io if you want to check it out. Um, you were talking about the history of Elm, and I think you were saying wasn't it like a researcher or PhD student that happened to
Yeah,
make the language?
yeah, yeah. So the creator of Elm, Evan Sablicki, um, he had started it as part of his, I think, graduate thesis. And I mean, he was originally looking at functional reactive programming,
Okay.
which is basically dealing with like how do you deal with these sort of like event-driven applications, but using functional programming techniques and not like having like stateful components and like stateful buckets and all these things. And he it also noticed like there were certain things he wanted to do, and I think this was like around, I think 2012 was when like Elm had its first release.
Okay.
So this was sort of before libraries like Java, like React, had gotten a lot of popularity. Like when we're in the days of jQuery, and maybe Angular had kind of like started picking up steam, but it was before we like people started really thinking about like doing this separation of what is the state of my application from like what are the views in my application, right?
Okay.
And we know like traditional. I know like you worked in like the .NET world. Like traditionally, like you have some app model and like MVVU where, oh, there's this window and this window knows about itself and it keeps track of a bunch of stuff. And okay, an event happens and like it sends some data over to a controller, and then the controller's like, cool, thanks. And then the controller might send some data back to the window. And there's like that back and forth, right?
Yeah.
Like your components talk to the controller talks back to the component. And Elm like was one of the first ones to take that very, very different view of no, there's a state, the update can change the state, the views just reflect the state. The end. Like that's it. And you don't, there's no like backwardsness.
Okay. So
So like even with React, like React separates like stateful components versus non-stateful components. And now like it's just the view, your view is just functions. It's just functions that take stuff in and like spit out HTML.
Yeah, it's changed a bit in React now because like you used to have class-based components, and I mean you still
Yeah.
have them, and then there was function components, but now you have stateful function components, which is if you're creating new components, that's typically the way you would go is write a function component, and if you need to have some
Hmm.
kind of component state, that's where you use like the React hooks and stuff. But you are correct. Like before, it was like class based is for stateful components, and the function based components were really just like here's a set of props, render me. So
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest barriers, I think, for a lot of people, uh, pure functional programming is like how intensely that sort of purity works. Like once you assign data to a name, like if you say like, oh, x equals this,
yeah,
you can't change that. Like you're no longer allowed to say, oh, well, x is now something else. Like that's once assigned, like something is what it is for the lifetime of that object in functional programming. And so like there's no idea of classes. Because classes by definitions are like, oh, this little bundle of data and functions that can change. In functional programming, well, you either have data and you have functions that work on that data, and that's it. And you're only like the other control structure is
yeah,
modules. But it sort of simplifies things in a way. And what I want to do over the next few like weeks and months, especially if the upcoming lightning talks and brown bags, is show people more about like how you can leverage that. The fact that, oh, I can like very clearly define a data type,
yeah,
but I also know that like once things are made, they won't change, and how I can use that to sort of like make very, very robust bulletproof applications, because like, oh, there's only one way I can change this data structure, and I know where it is, and I'm the one doing it,
yeah.
and the code can't do it implicitly, and that can make debugging so much easier.
Yeah, I tend to uh, in terms of I'm writing JavaScript right now, but I've done a lot of TypeScript as well. But uh, people were saying initially, like when TypeScript, like I haven't really done any Angular with like Angular 2 and up. I did it when it was Angular 1.4, but like the big thing with when Angular 2 came out was it was all TypeScript. You could still write in JavaScript, but
Hmm.
I think they used a lot of class-based stuff, and like most of the JavaScript I write, it's always functions. Like the only time I was really
Yep.
using classes was prior. We're using Preact, not React at Forum, but uh, when we had stateful components before we upgraded to Preact 10, which supports hooks and all that stuff, that's the only time I use classes was to create a stateful component. Everything else, it's like functions, and it to me it just makes sense. I find it's just a lot easier to test things. With JavaScript, you have modules, so you just you can kind
Hmm.
of group things. You don't have to make it a class. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
so, and I don't know. I just find it easier, and I I can't think of a time where I've needed a class in like the last 3 or 4 years writing JavaScript. Um, yeah.
Yeah. So I started with Python,
Hmm.
and Python and JavaScript are similar in the sense that it's a very similar thing. Like you don't need classes. And I started off very much being like I wrote a lot of functions. Then when I discovered classes, I'm like, oh, I'm going to use these everywhere. And I'm like, wait, no, this is a terrible idea. And then I went back, and functional programs just like don't have classes at all. So it's that same thing. Like control is done through data types, functions, and modules. But now that I've come back to a language with classes, I've been writing a lot of TypeScript, and I really like the language. Um, there are times where like, okay, I just need sort of like a little bit of control over an entity,
Yeah.
and I'm like, I don't know if I want to dedicate an entire module to that. So I have like, I'm not very. I mean, maybe this like goes against sort of the functional rules, but I'm not very like absolutist on it.
Yeah.
Um, there's definitely times where, okay, I'm like, okay, I can see a good use case for a class, but there's never a time where it's like, oh well, this has to be a class. It's like this could be a module. This
Yeah.
could even be a function once in a while. But it's like, okay, right now a class feels like it works best, and it's gonna help the readability and then like all the things like we look for, right? Like one, does the code work? Two, does it make it more readable? Does it make it more maintainable? And like, is it easy to like extend later? You know?
Yeah.
So I'm very much on like use the control structure for the job, whatever language you're in. You know, like use the tools that you have, and like that can work out. But functional programming was like really big for me in just I don't know. I think like it really helped my ability to design APIs
Okay.
and to like take a working problem in real life and translate that into okay, well, like what does the code need to accomplish?
Yeah.
So I definitely recommend that people check it out, and that's why I made this project, this whole Quarto thing. You know, it's like it's open source, but like it's not a library or a framework. It's just like it's meant to be a perpetually small, accessible project that people can dive into and like learn out. You know?
Cool, cool. We'll definitely get into it. I was just gonna say what you were saying. Like, I'm not a diehard functional programmer. Like, I'm just like I most of the time just writing functions is good enough for me. I don't need anything. And but it's not to say that object oriented programming is bad. You know, they have different use cases, and that the only time I've seen because I did a lot of C sharp before. The thing I found with
Yeah,
there's a couple things, and this is just like it's not so much it's uh it's more
just like language design.
yeah, well it's really more like people don't necessarily create the proper abstractions on things, and then
Hmm.
like for example, say you make a class which is, I don't know, customer, and then you just start piling on all these methods on it because you're just like, well, it's kind of related to, and the other thing I've seen that I've actually lived through is it can cause refactoring nightmares if you inherit too much.
Yes,
Like in my
yes,
experience, I've seen once you go past two levels of inheritance, it just causes refactoring issues, and I think it comes back to the same thing, which is maybe that wasn't the right abstraction. Just because two things are
yeah,
kind of similar, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to put them together. And I think it kind of ties into writing dry code that people sometimes take it too literally. Like, like even
yeah,
in UI stuff,
100%.
sometimes you duplicate stuff. It's totally fine. Maybe a code generates stuff. That's 100% okay because you've automated it, like, so there's been a few folks that have written about like finding the right abstraction, like Sebastian, I think his last name is pronounced Mark Bogue from Facebook, who's on the React team. He's like, he has this talk from 2014, I think. I'll try and find it, but maybe this is not the right abstraction. And then I think the other one was from Sandy Metz, who does a lot of Ruby. She has a talk about it. I'll try and find those. But while I'm searching for those, why don't you just kind of let us know, I guess first, what is Quarto? And then
Oh
let's
yeah,
talk
sure,
about
sure,
let's
sure.
talk about the project too.
Yeah, this is a great chance to judge my readme because I'm just going to take it directly
You're in a
from
safe space. It's
yeah,
okay. Only the internet's watching.
only the internet,
Yeah.
right?
What could
No,
go
no,
wrong?
because like it, because I mean, I started this project around the time of Hacktoberfest, Locks October, which like you were doing a ton of work at that time, and Virtual Coffee was like we were really trying to figure out this, how do we make good experiences for people when they're coming into open source, and I think like the answer we sort of came to was that the typical, I want to say, of hey, find a random project and just like dive in isn't like there's no guarantee of getting sort of the type of interaction and engagement that would make you think, oh yeah, this is something I like to do.
Okay.
I realized it actually took like it takes a lot of time and a lot of framing and a lot of effort to make a repository that is actually inviting to people, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So this was my attempt at that. So we can scroll down to whatever words I said before. Um, So yeah, so Quarto. What is Quarto? Quarto is a board game, kind of obscure, invented I think by like a Dutch mathematician.
Okay.
It's like I call it like advanced tic tac toe, although there's like other like tic tac toe. But essentially, I'll scroll down. There's like a nice
So
image
it
over
sounds like
here.
a bunch of mathematicians were drunk one night and they just said, yeah,
Yeah,
blah blah blah, something something
yeah,
quarter.
yes. Yeah. So this is the board. This is the pieces. So the way Quarter works, it's basically you are trying to get four in a row of one of the dimensions of the pieces. So every piece has a height, short or tall. It has a shape like round or square. It has a color, light or dark, and then it has like sort of the top, like either it's a flat or it's like divoted. So any four in a row, and you win the game. So it's like half tic tac toe, half connect four.
Okay.
The trick is you pick the piece for the other person to play,
Oh,
and that's where
I
sort of
didn't
like
know
this,
that.
yes,
So this is
right?
okay.
And see, as soon as you hear that, you're like, oh, wait a minute, this there's some shenanigans here, right? So it's not just like a you have to play in a good spot, but like you have to play knowing you're gonna give the next person their piece, and then they can play anywhere. So you're trying to like keep that, you know, it becomes like a very interesting game.
Okay.
I found it at random when I was doing an internship for a consulting company that did a lot of Ruby. So, you know, that's how that happened. And
Okay.
like I never found it again for years, and then I found it again. Actually, we can jump to the implementation of the game. Let me see if I can pull it up really quick. Because I also have it live on Netlify.
Okay. You can pop in the address here if you want to just give a kind of like a quick demo
Yeah,
of the
I'm
game.
just gonna.
I
Yeah,
know we're
we
not here
can
to
we
learn
can jump
Cordo. We're
into
here
it.
to talk a bit about Elm, but you might as well just show how the game works to some degree.
Yeah, and that was again like in this whole idea of what is what is a good experience for people getting into an open source application. It's like, well, people like it when they can see a demo of the thing, you know,
Oh yeah, for sure.
whether it's a framework or a tool. Like I'll be honest, whenever I have to look at a new package, some of them will be like, hey, here's a live demo, and some will be like, hey, you can just like run this on your thing if you just like do the npm stuff. Like I don't want to do that.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't like it. There's just definitely like a little barrier there.
yeah.
Hold on,
There's a
see if I can get this to work.
Here, I'll close this for now. You can share it after if you want.
There we go.
Um,
I got the link, so I should be able to come back.
okay, cool.
We're gonna go here. The fact that we can both control the screen terrifies me.
Yeah, yeah, no, I was telling Kirk before the stream, I'm just trying out some software called CoScreen. One of the founders from the company gave me a demo. It looks pretty cool, so I'm just trying it out. I've used it outside of a streaming, just trying it in the stream, just to see how it is. Okay, so we're looking at a quarter board here. I guess first
Yeah,
we won't talk too much about quarter because I do want to get to Elm, but
yeah.
just a couple potentially obvious questions. But what's the point of the different sizes of the pieces and the colors? Well, I mean the colors, obviously, one player versus the other, I guess. But um,
So that's the thing. Any player can play any piece. These are just
oh,
like the ways in which you can win. So you can win by having four big pieces in a row, four small pieces in a row,
okay,
four hollow pieces in a row, four circles in a row. Like you just need to get four of like some common dimension.
okay, gotcha.
So the first thing you do is you pick a piece, and then the computer is gonna like place it somewhere on the board.
Okay,
And
so I just click one.
so just I don't know, whichever one you want. Yeah, anyone you want.
Okay.
And this is the part where I realize that I'm obviously like not a great designer. I will, if anyone wants to help me like make a better like design, you should totally do that, because this is very much like an MVP. Like I need it to work. Okay, so
That's all
this
good.
computer has now picked this piece for you. You choose somewhere on the board. You can play it.
Okay.
Yeah, and just behind the scenes, this is just like a fairly like straightforward random function on the. So that's the thing. You don't like the computer has picked the small red square for you, so you just choose somewhere on the board and it will put it down.
Oh, okay, I see.
Right. And now you pick a piece for the computer to play, and that's how your turns go.
Oh, okay, 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 gotcha.
So you play, you pick a piece for your opponent, they play, they pick a piece for you, and you go like that. So now you're choosing a piece that the computer is going to choose somewhere to put down.
Okay, so I'll pick this one. Okay, and then I click. Okay,
Okay, so now it's choosing for you. It selected the big, while we're all picking red pieces, but it's fun.
okay, and so basically the goal to win the game is to have as many big pieces potentially, or
You just want four in a row. So like
okay,
that, it becomes like regular tic-tac-toe rules.
okay,
You just
gotcha.
need four of something. So like at the top there, four reds could win, or four circles could win, or four like big ones could win. Like that's all still available.
Okay,
But like
gotcha.
as you play pieces, stuff gets cut off, and then you have to get a little more tactical.
Okay. I'm clearly
Um,
not trying to win here. I'm just clicking around just to see things going on. But okay. I see what you mean. Okay, so
yeah,
so it I would guess on
and we
this
don't have to finish the game.
I would guess on
Yeah,
the surface it might appear like a simple game, but I'm guessing it's not.
yeah, and I mean, so I mean, I knew I was going to do a game in Elm. Um, and initially it was going to be a Domino's game. I used to have a Domino's, like a working one
Okay.
implemented. I think I still have the code in my GitHub. But there's like a ton of Domino's games apparently. Like I did an app search. I'm like, oh, there's like a million of these. I mean, Domino's is my favorite game, but okay. I'm like, I wanted something. I didn't want to do something like tic tac toe
Okay.
because that's like a fairly solved concept.
Yeah.
But I also wanted like so sufficient complexity, but I'm not trying to like remake Catan, you
Okay,
know?
gotcha, gotcha.
And it had to have like rules that I could get across to someone, and then you could see it in the code base. So after a lot of deliberation, Quarto kind of like popped to the top, and it's kind of like a curious thing. So people was like, "Oh, what's this?" And we can kind of get into it.
Cool. Okay, so we've gotten like kind of brief overview of concepts of Elm, Quarto, kind of what it is. So
Mm-hmm.
let's maybe talk a bit about the code. I don't know if you want to share your editor or if you want to go into right into the code right here in the browser and just talk about it. Like we don't have to necessarily code some new stuff
Mm-hmm.
today. It's just kind of more to see what kind of get the lay of the land of how Elm works, I guess.
But yeah, well, let's start here with like the top level library. I mean, the main thing is Elm is very much mm, tries to be appealing to people who haven't done functional programming before,
Okay.
and especially JavaScript developers. So most of what you see here is like the fairly standard like web development package, right? Um, you've got your npm set up. I'm using Netlify, so I have like no.
Your Toml
I
file.
never know how to pronounce that. Toml,
I say
TOML.
Toml, but if it's called
Toml sounds
I
right.
don't know, or 2ML, but that sounds like converted to machine learning, so I just say Toml. I
Yeah,
think that's
right.
I think if you're a good developer, you're supposed to call it Toml, but I'm not sure.
Oh, I'm just going to call it the Netlify file. The main difference you'll see is we have this elm.json, and we can like peek into that.
Okay.
Um, but surprise, it's very much like your package.json, but it's specifically for Elm packages.
Okay.
Um, so Elm has like there's basically just one package library for Elm. I think like it's package.elm.com. Cool thing about Elm is that let's say the version of Elm gets a major upgrade from like so right now Elm is on 0.19.
Yeah.
Let's say it does like a upgrade to like 0.20, 0.21 or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, Packages that have not changed their um, like basically like their what versions I work on
Okay.
will no longer run.
Oh, no way.
The Yeah, it'll like the Elm thing will stop me until like, hey, these are not valid. Like it will automatically do that.
Okay.
Which is safe because you know that like you're never running like outdated versions. Like every package manager has gone to their repo and has at least said like, oh yeah, this works on the new one.
Okay, gotcha.
But sometimes you end up in weird situations where it's like, okay, I know this thing works, but the person hasn't upgraded their stuff yet, and I want to use it, and it gets a little weird. But I've only run into that like one time,
Okay.
And the Elm communities, like I just DM the person like, hey, are you still working on this, or you can like just do a local clone or something. So that's usually fine.
Okay.
Um,
And I
yeah,
had a
and I think we talked about this.
I had a
Yeah.
quick question about this. So, sorry if I'm gonna jump in because there's a lot of this stuff is new. So they went with their own JSON file just kind of for the reasons you just mentioned because they do their own checking like
Yes.
when you install it in npm you install an Elm package and then this comes along with that when you install it, or is this a file that gets auto generated, or do you build this file or
This file will be auto-generated. I think the first time, like like you have your versions of like Elm init for a new Elm project, and it'll set that all up for you.
okay.
Yeah, and it's tracking like, of course, like your direct dependencies, indirect dependencies, your tests. It's if you're used to um, a package.json file, it is very similar, but it's just like very Elm specific.
Okay.
And like we talked about before, all these packages are essentially like themselves pure. Like they don't Elm packages as of like 0.19 can't execute their own JavaScript in the background.
Okay.
So like these are 100% Elm packages, and everything in there is like 100% pure.
Okay.
So that is good to know. That's also another source of content. I should say like Elm is a very opinionated language and framework. Like there's definitely like things go like this and not like this. Um, that sometimes causes consternation by people getting into the language who may prefer a different way of doing things. Like the
Okay.
formatter, there is one formatter. It is called Elm format.
Okay.
People are like, hey, where's the config for Elm format? There isn't a config. That defeats the whole purpose of having one format. You know,
I gotta say I'm okay
and
with that. Like
I know,
it's I mean I use Prettier pretty much on every project now, and it's like it's just a debate.
don't want to go
I
back.
just don't want to debate about like whether it's over two lines or like it's got semicolons or not, or like
Yeah,
at the end of like it's the most unproductive part of a code review if you're going over like code formatting, which is why these tools exist. So
exactly.
yeah.
And I mean, even like the package manager, it's just like, okay, there's one package manager, there's one major compiler, and are there people who need special use cases? Yes. Are they like more than perhaps like 10% of the user base? Probably not. Like maybe they're like 5%, right? So
Yeah.
Elm makes a lot of, and like Elm tends to prioritize readability,
Okay.
and which is something I think, I don't know if you've ever seen the syntax for languages like Haskell.
I've
It's like Haskell's very readable once you know Haskell, but if you don't know it, it's very very difficult to get into. Um, So like one of the things you can't do in Elm is you cannot define like custom operators.
okay.
Like you can't turn symbols. You can't give like you can't make functions out of like symbols. You have to use words. You have to use like alphanumeric
Oh, okay,
characters,
okay, okay. I got you.
uh, right? So there's a lot of stuff in Haskell where I would write it as like a dollar sign or something like that. Like Elm's just like, no, you have to say the word map because which and like a lot of people will bristle at that because like my code is getting more wordy. It's like, well, yes, but it's also getting more clear, right? And I
Okay.
think sometimes as developers, like we over prioritize brevity. Like brevity is nice, it looks elegant, but if it's increasing the amount of like spin cycles someone's brain has to take to understand what you're doing, is it actually worth it? And it gets back into our conversation earlier about like what is the appropriate abstraction, right?
Yeah. And it's not always obvious, and it's like I don't know. It's not a hard and fast rule, but I'd be like, if I've reused something twice now, still keep them copies like like it's still a copy. If I hit three,
Yeah,
I might start to consider, should I create some function or something to, that's reusable. But at the same time, it's like earlier on in my career, I would have said, yeah, I hit number three, it's got to go and share it. But again, it comes back to that, like, is it really the right abstraction? Like, even if it means, yes, you're not duplicating that code now, it still might not be the
yeah,
right thing. And I don't know. I think people I don't know. I'm just generalizing here, and I have no data to back this, but I think sometimes folks just think, like, oh, just keep it dry, and it's like it's not. I don't know.
You
I
know?
don't think people say keep it wet, but like, maybe sometimes, it's okay. It doesn't matter if it's,
Yeah, I mean, I recently, because I've been talking smack on Twitter about now that I'm having to do more React work and JavaScript work, I said like, why do we make so many files in like JS land? Like, does every component need its own file? Like, does every little label need its own file? Um, and yeah, I mean, I think it's, and people say, oh, like, what's the right length for a file? But like, I don't really have an answer for that. It's like
yeah,
at a certain point, there is there's a certain point where it's like, okay, the amount of code in here, like I've lost like the ability to like find my way. But like until I hit that pain point, like that's when I refactor. This is the
yeah,
same thing. Like when do I need to turn this into like split this out? Okay, when I hit a pain point, and it depends on the function, it depends on the type of code I'm writing. Like that might not happen like after 7 times. It might still be worth it to just write it out.
yeah. No, for sure.
So yeah, definitely with time, I've gone away from like hard and fast rules. Like Avery's like, oh, you should never have a function more than 10 lines. Like sometimes 10 lines make sense. Like I'm not gonna look at like an 11-line function that makes sense to me. Like, it's over 11. I gotta, you gotta like make those. But I guess it come with experience. You get better at like making those decisions, right?
Yeah, and I can definitely relate to this because I mean, I'll post it in the chat, but I have a post I did about like just stuff where like I set up ESLint Prettier and all that stuff, but like
Mm-hmm.
on our continuous integration when we have our builds, we have something called code climate, and we'll get errors every now and then, like this code is duplicated in 4 files. It happens a lot in front end stuff, like Preact components, because the props might look similar, but it's not something that you need to consolidate necessarily, because
Right.
other things are like you were saying, it'll like we have a threshold for like number of lines in a file, so it'll say like, oh, this function is like it's longer or whatever, say like the function was like 13 lines and then that's the max and then we have 16. It's like not really that big a deal. And
Now shut it down,
yeah,
roll it back, roll it all back.
and yeah, and the other thing with tools like Prettier, for example, they format it so like you could end up with, like, especially with JSX, it can end up on multiple lines, and and
Yep.
that doesn't really mean like if your JSX component, your chunk of JSX, could have fit on one line, but it ended up putting on four. It seems kind of silly to say pull that away from the count. I don't know. There's just stuff like that. It's
Yeah.
just I find all these things are. It's good to have guidelines. Doesn't mean you have to
Yes.
always follow them. It's like text. It's when people say like textbook example. Like I can think of sports.
Hmm.
Like when I played rugby, you're supposed to tackle somebody a certain way. You get low. You have to put the side of your head on the side of their body, like on their butt cheek essentially, and then you wrap your arms around, and then you kind of tip them over, or go forward, and then you drive with your shoulder. That's like textbook, but that doesn't always happen in like a game. Like I, I don't know. It's a silly example, but like you still made the tackle. But it wasn't textbook.
Yeah.
Is it that big a deal? I don't know. Um,
Yeah. I
anyways,
mean, at the end of the day, I think like it's good to have rules, right? And like that's why we do contributing docs. That's why we do like how to's. That's why we make all these things so that like there's a standard that people can aim for. But at the end of the day, I like what matters is like again, does the code work?
yeah,
Is it readable? Is it testable? And we can't just like automate it all away.
yeah, for sure.
And with that, we can kind of like jump into the code base.
Yeah, yeah. Nice
Um,
transition.
I I've been in this game for a long time. Not really. Okay, so let's kind of talk about like the code base itself and just like dive into what Elm looks like. So this is our main file.
Okay.
Um, the your I guess core file needs to have this main function, but like you can name it whatever you want. So let's talk about this from the get-go. So at the beginning, at the top, of course, module, name of the module, what you're exposing. With Elm 0.19, I think you're no longer allowed to do like exposing all. Like that's no longer like valid. Like you used to be, you could just say like, hey, everything in this I want to share. No more. You have to like be explicit in what leaves the module.
Okay.
And in the same way, when you do your imports, you have to sort of like be explicit in what you're taking from a module.
Okay.
So you can either do qualified imports, or if you're doing unqualified, like here the document, like you have to say like, okay, this is the unqualified one. I really love this. Like this is the way I do like all. I hate, and this is a big frustration for me where I don't know where things are coming from,
Okay.
and I'm like, okay, this this name that I'm looking at, is this a name coming from in this document or not?
Hmm.
So I love qualified imports. I'm perfectly fine of doing like thing dot thing. So I just have some context about like where is this coming from, except for like very, very obvious cases. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So Elm just kind of like has that as a default.
and
That's just how it is.
some questions here. So the as nav is an alias or and
Yes,
then
that's an alias.
just because I've done a bunch of TypeScript and C sharp, saying exposing document is basically saying I imported spa.document. I'm gonna call it document, but I am just confirming that its type is document. Is that what that means?
No, so this is saying, okay, import the module spot document
Yeah.
as the name, type alias document, and we're exposing some object in it called document. So in this case, it just happened to be
Okay.
like this document module has some data type document as like its core data type.
Oh, okay, okay. So
Um,
it's like a
yeah,
named export in JavaScript, kind of.
yes,
Okay, okay, gotcha.
yes. So these in these parentheses, it's always going to be either a function or a data type.
Okay, gotcha.
That's like all there is. So that's like all that can come out. Yeah. So you have your browser library for, I guess, sort of obvious reasons,
Yeah.
or maybe not obvious reasons, but like it's front end programming, so this has like a bunch of like browser related
And that
things.
brings up another
Um,
interesting question. Like we're obviously Quarto is a web-based game, but is
yes.
Elm used for stuff that isn't web-based, or is it really a layer? Like, is it under the hood? It generates markup and like you can't write HTML, right? You does it do all that for you, or
You can. I mean, so it's in the same way you can sort of like inline HTML, CSS, and all that in React, right? Like you can just put that into your JSX files.
okay,
Elm will let you do the same thing.
okay,
Elm in general is pretty agnostic with how you want to do things like styling.
okay,
So there's like you can just do your regular style sheets if you'd like that's fine. Because at the end of the day, like this is all just going to turn into like a JavaScript file that you're going to reference from your index.html, right?
yeah,
So you can always link to an external style sheet. There is Elm CSS. Somebody took the time to create a completely tight CSS, which took forever.
okay,
But like, so you can use like CSS with types, and it will give you compiler warnings if your CSS is incorrect, if you're using the wrong units, like that type of stuff, which is by itself super helpful. But there's also like Elm versions of like all the means, like Tailwind, whatever you like. Like you kind of have the option.
okay, because it's open
This
source.
project
People are
uses,
doing whatever they want to, basically.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, like the I should say like the Elm community is very very active, super friendly. The first Slack I was ever in was the Elm Slack. It's very 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 new developer friendly. It's like dedicated people in the beginner channel and general channels for like answering people's questions. I've gotten like a ton of support. I would say like the best way to learn Elm, the official docs are very good. I think
Okay.
they get you diving in right away, and it's a good progression. And if you have like any trouble, you just hit the Slack, and there's always something there.
All
I mean,
right.
also you can also like message me. I'm always willing to like help people out with that. But yeah, so this is using one library called Elm UI. Elm
Okay.
UI is takes a very, unlike all the others I mentioned, Elm UI takes a very radical approach to um, front end design.
Mm-hmm.
UI basically sort of like says, okay, what if we just had to do this all from scratch? And we can see a little bit of like how it thinks about stuff. If you're used to Flexbox, it's very, very similar. In Elm UI, you basically have like three types of containers.
Okay.
Either it's a single container, it's a row of items, or it's a column of items. And those are like the three things you can define, and like everything sort of like builds on there.
Okay.
And I think under the hood, it does sort of like basically become like very, 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 very controlled like Flexbox.
And I
Um,
have
they're also using this thing. Oh, go ahead.
I had one other question before we go on. Just seeing like on line 6 to 8 there where it says spa.document, so spa meaning single page application. Can can you
Hmm.
build a a non-spa application with Elm? Like it's still a
Absolutely.
okay. So this is just this particular
Yeah.
example that we're doing. Okay.
Yes. So I'm using a framework, I guess, called Elm Spa. Elm is very big on like name it what it does.
Okay.
So one of my other things with JavaScript is I never know. Hey, you guys using Next? Nah, man, I'm using Nux. I'm using Jekyll. I'm just like we just make up words. So Elm's very big. Like the formatter is called Elm format. Like
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Elm Spa is called Elm Spa. The UI one is called like Elm UI. Like it's very much like, oh, what does this thing do? That's what it is.
Ah,
Um,
naming's hard.
so the guy, yeah. So this was created by Ryan. I'm forgetting his last name, but he's like a super cool dude. And it's basically like a very quick like gets like the proper structure.
Okay.
So the way Elm Spa applications work, like it already has the built-in concept of the parts of the model that are shared by the entire application and the parts of the model that are on a single page.
Okay.
And it like bakes in the routing. So I know like there's like the React routing library. So like it does a similar thing and it just like gives you like a nice space to, if you want to make an SPA, I would say just start with Elm Spot. But you don't have to do that. In the end, like Elm doesn't have to be your entire web app. Like it's very easy to just have like a piece of it be Elm. And a lot of people, when they introduce it to a code base, they don't just like remake the entire thing in Elm. Like, okay, let's try this page in it.
Okay.
Let's try this page in it because it's, at the end, you just get like a nice little bundled JS file that you can execute. So you don't have, you never have to go that route. And there's a couple, like there's Elm static.
Okay.
If you want to do, you use Elm to like make the site and do your layout and all your styling, and then it just like spits out like static HTML and CSS. So
Okay.
very, very, where you need it, you can have that type thing.
Um,
Um,
had another quick question about Elm.
Go for it.
I'm assuming it's not as popular as something like React, Angular, Vue.
Hmm.
Is there anybody using Elm in production? And I don't mean that as a knock on Elm. I'm just like literally curious. Like, if there.
Yeah, no, no, that's a valid question. I So every year, the same way there's like the state of JavaScript survey, there is a state of Elm survey. See that you may have noticed, but like a lot of Elm developers are also JavaScript developers.
Okay, yeah.
I feel like the two main flows that people come from for Elm are JavaScript and Haskell. So like either you're coming from like the functional side, you're like, hey, how do I do websites and still do this, or you're coming from the JavaScript side, like, hey, how do I do functional but still do this?
Okay.
Um, but to answer your question, there are, I would say, like quite a few companies using Elm in the wild. I don't have hard numbers right now. I want to, but I know, I think at least a few, I'm gonna say like a few hundred companies.
Okay.
And it's been, I know, like even in some of like sort of the major players that we think of, like what do I call them, the FANGs, FAANGs
The
of the world.
Fangs.
Yeah, FANGs. Um, there's usually it's obviously not like the entire code base, but Elm, I feel like Elm is pretty much like in some part in like everybody all over the place. But there are some companies, especially I know a lot of European companies, they're just completely powered by Elm. So yeah, we write like our code base is 20,000 lines of Elm code. That is what we write. That is how all our front end development works. The big, I think, champions for Elm that people know about are No Red Ink. especially Richard Feltman, who works at that company.
Yeah, because yeah,
Um,
he's a big
and
fan.
yeah,
I don't. I just that's how I kind of came across Elm. I've never used Elm,
mhm.
but I think I follow him on Twitter, and he's clearly a fan of it. So
Yeah, yeah. The company was such a fan that they're like, "Hey, Evan, you should just like work for us, and just your job is to make Elm great because like it's already great, and we want it to be more great."
okay,
So it definitely sees like commercial use, and I would say it's such a weird thing with open source frameworks and version naming because like nobody really cares. Okay, this thing works, cool. Like no one's really checking like, oh, it's not 1.0, it's not ready yet.
yeah,
But like Elm still is a maturing language. Like even with the latest release, like it broke backwards compatibility in a few ways, which some people were not very happy about. But it's like, well, the language is still growing and they're still figuring out like what works and what doesn't.
yeah,
But yeah, definitely, I would say definitely production ready. I mean, I've used it on pretty much every um, front end project I've ever done, and yeah, no complaints.
that's cool.
Quirks, but no complaints. And I can't say it's like any more quirks than I would have with anything else. It's just like different problem.
Yeah,
And a lot of problems I just don't have at all. So I didn't say this until now, and I'm going to be like shamed by the Elm gods. But like one of Elm's big selling points is no runtime errors.
yeah,
It's just never had one. Like most people, just like we've never. You get a lot of compile time errors. You can get like logic stuff, but like your Elm program will not crash because you sort of can't get into like an invalid state that would cause it to be like I don't know what's going on. Like the compiler probably like it won't compile until like you pretty much like covered all your cases. So
okay. But
that's like a really nice selling point, right?
but it won't crash in the sense that the code that was compiled is not meant to crash, but like obviously network conditions or something like that.
Right,
Like if the
right, right, right,
request
right.
doesn't
Yeah.
come back, it will definitely break just like a regular app unless you handle that
Well,
potentially.
no, you because if you are doing a request to work in Elm, you have to like provide what should happen during an error state. Like you can't just like there's no such thing as like oh like even when you're doing like importing JSON,
Okay.
like Elm you have to okay this is what we do if we got what we wanted, and but you also have to at least build in like this is what we do when we don't.
Okay.
Even if the answer is like it does nothing and like the page stays the way it is, but like you have to tell it that. So it's never like you're never gonna hit like a oh this data is the wrong or expected int when I expected string like that just cannot happen.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha.
Um, which is really nice because it just you just I don't know. It's the concept of like safety when coding. It's like, oh, I know, like, oh, if I can get this to compile, my app will run, and I don't have to worry about the app going down.
Okay.
The wider world might go crazy, but you can be guaranteed that your Elm will never stop working,
Okay. Cool.
which is pretty cool.
All right.
I did. There was like a funny story of some people working on Elm, and when they did, they found some errors. I think in like one of the like in the Rails library
Okay.
because the JSON was like not failing because like Elm says like if you don't get back the JSON you said you were going to give me like I'm not going to take it.
Okay.
They're like oh it's not the JSON and they're like they found out like the API was actually had like a couple errors in it, so that was pretty fun.
That's cool.
Anyway,
All right.
yeah, let's like dive into the code a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. Like I know we've spent a lot of time talking about some concepts and stuff, but yeah, let's dig a bit into code. I want to be uh, make sure like I know I have to go pick up my daughter in 30 minutes and I'm sure
Yes.
you have other stuff to do too. But let's definitely dive in
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I'd say
yeah. So
maybe
let's like just
dive in
walk
some
through what's
more next
here.
time too. But let's get started to just see a bit what's going on here.
Yeah, totally. So every Elm file, and I guess we sort of talked about this before. Elm uses like that NVU cycle. Like, there's a model, which is the state of your application, the one source of truth of your application, very similar to Redux.
Okay.
There is the update, which is the only thing that is allowed to change the model. There are your views. Your views are your view is essentially just a big function, right? That like takes in the model and spits out HTML and CSS.
Okay.
We have two extra features, and like this is all usually bundled into this program type. So program takes flags, models, messages, and like basically that's fed into the Elm runtime, and the Elm runtime handles everything else.
Okay.
You don't really have so like what I've noticed with React is there's a bunch of spaces where you can sort of like insert things while it's processing. And Elm has sort of like less of those like inserts. If you set this up, the Elm runtime goes, it will sort of like optimize itself for browser refresh rate. It will handle like making sure the virtual DOM and the DOM don't like get into like it'll do all of that. You just focus on writing your data types and your functions.
Okay.
So you're never writing like really like how effects work. You just tell it the effects you want, and it'll get those out.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is back to like my big file debate. Like in functional programming, I feel like people tend to write like larger files, and in like the JS world. So basically, your init where you set up the initial state of the application. So this is our model. Like we're splitting it into the shared model and the model for the individual pages on the application.
Okay.
The only thing I keep in the shared model right now, I think, is just like the viewport info. So at any given time, I know the height and width of the window, and I do like a little bit of accessibility and responsiveness based on that.
Okay.
And then the page is what keeps like everything we need for the actual page that you're looking at. Commands are something we'll probably definitely have to go into like the next time. But commands are basically how you do like these sort of like stateful effects.
Okay.
And you sort of bash like when you want to do an HTTP request or like anything that requires some actual thing in the world to take place. You put that in a command, you hand that to the runtime will execute it, it'll pass it back through the update, and then you can decide how that affects your model. So you're in that,
Okay.
that's part of your
So the commands are always effects then?
yeah, pretty much. Like if you're using a command, you're trying to be effectful. So we can talk about a quick example here because it's used in this project. Obviously, my computer player isn't actually like super smart, right? Like it's just like choosing at random.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think of a random function, by definition, a random function is impure because you can call it with the same input and get different output, right? Like that's how random works. Like it's the same function, but it gives you different numbers every time.
Yeah.
So there is no way like to purely do randomness. So random has to go through a command. You tell like, hey, get me back this random number, and it's going to do that, and it's going to like bring that back in for you.
Okay.
And like that's like one of those things where in like the JavaScript world, like it's super easy to do random. You just find the library, you call it, you get the number. In Elm, you have to do a little bit more work because that's essentially a side effect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have our update. So all these things, you can name these whatever you want, but there is certain conventions. So whereas as in Redux, you have a reducer, we call it just the update.
Okay.
The update takes a message and a model and spits out an updated model and maybe a command message.
Okay.
So still very similar to React. So here I define like all the messages that can be in this application. Basically, when the page changes, when I get a message from shared where the URL changes, someone clicks a link, and like in the update, case statements and case expressions are very big and functionally tend to prefer case statements over if statements because it will automatically tell you if you haven't handled every case of a particular data type. So here, our message type has like 4 distinct states. So we have to address all 4 states.
Yeah.
And like the compiler will not compile if you haven't, and it'll tell you like, hey, you said 3, which is really great. Because like let's say you define like a new message.
Okay.
If I update it here, the compiler will tell me every single place in the code where I haven't dealt with this new case. And I just have to follow the compiler.
Okay.
So one of the things people like about Elm is that like people are less scared to refactor because they're you don't have to worry so much that you're going to end up in a place like, oh, if I covered everything, like did I do this? The compiler will immediately tell you where you need to go to get everything like back on track. So that's pretty cool.
Okay. And just to
Mhm.
let people know, I'm just making assumptions here, but this looks like a union type in TypeScript, so this means the message can
Yes.
be any four of those. And
Yes.
since it's a switch case, there's probably a case where none of those is found and you throw or handle that case, or is that just automatically included to say that?
So that's the thing. It's so yes, very much, pretty much the equivalent. This is like your unions in TypeScript. A lot of TypeScript's advanced typing
Yeah.
are very much functional programming concepts, and they're really good. Things like unions, intersection types, custom types, and stuff like that. But yeah, you don't sort of need to deal with a default case here because like this will never accept anything but these, right? Because like you said, like, oh, this I take
Okay.
a message type. So like you can't even like pass in something that's not a message type. So once you've addressed all the cases for that, like you're good to go. Like you would never need a default because
Okay.
that's not a thing that's possible to do.
Okay. Gotcha.
We can look we can look at a piece of code and I think okay, so this is like the main file,
Yeah.
but most of the action. Oh, and I guess we can quickly talk. Like the last thing is like the view.
Okay.
Like this is a very much a top level file, like your app, typically in a React app, and you've sort of put most of the stuff in like individual components.
Okay.
So the view, you just render the shared dot view and then the individual page. So on the Quarto, we'll just jump back so I can show people. So the shared app, like this bar up here is part of the shared model. This part down here is part of the shared model.
Okay.
This page is an individual page. If we go to about, then different page, but the shared stuff stays the same.
Okay. Gotcha.
And like the Elm runtime keeps track of like only rendering what's changed and all the fun stuff that we also have with React.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. And here, subscriptions. So we talked about commands and subscriptions. Subscriptions are basically if you have some external event that you need the code to be aware of, some API call, something like that, you can pass it into a subscription. So,
Okay.
um,
And is that a pipe command
mhm.
I see on line 123?
Yes, it is. I heard JavaScript is getting pipes. I'm
Yeah.
super excited about that.
That's a
Big on
Haskell
pipes.
operator, right? That they brought into here.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much all pure functional programming languages use the pipe operator, right? Like F sharp, Haskell, Elm, pure script. I want to say, I feel like it should because so much of the design is like type, like just taking like it's all expression based, right? Like I calculate this, feed it into this, feed it into this, feed it into this. So to avoid sort of like infinite parentheses, you have things like the pipe operator and also like the dot operator when for like chaining functions and stuff like that. So
Okay.
we're very big on pipes. Piping is one of the things that some people will do anything to get their functions to be like these very nice looking pipes.
Okay.
And sometimes you're like, okay, yes, this looks like nice and elegant, but maybe we should not do it like this. Maybe we should actually like use some helper functions and kind of break it up. But no one ever wants to do that because it just looks so nice when you just pipe. And everything in Elm is a function, including like operators.
Okay.
So like I've done something where like I piped the plus, like I need to add two things, and you do like plus, and then you put in like the two variables instead of like you can get too intense about it. Okay, the last thing I want to show you before we head out is this main file here, this game.elm, because pretty much the entire game like is
Okay.
based from like this main file. And the key thing I want to talk about of functional programming is actually not the functions at all, which is why I just wish it was named something else. It's actually the types.
Yeah.
So TypeScript, I think, did it right by calling it TypeScript. TypeScript has a very powerful typing system, the ability to make custom types. And I think that is the main sort of driving force of functional programming. That happens to be what I think is like my favorite part of programming, which is domain modeling, making these like very distinct types to define your application. And really, the functions are just sort of transformers, right? Going from type to type as you go from, okay, like
Yeah.
what is the type of the things I'm getting in and what's coming out. So here we sort of define the entire game. So this player is either human or computer, basic union type. using type aliases were appropriate to add clarity to
Yeah.
different parts of the application. So here, okay, this active player is just a player, but I can say active player. So when you're reading through the code, you're like, oh, like you can get more context. The winner is also a player.
Yeah.
So we have the cells, the cell in Elm. These are records. These are just like very similar to JavaScript objects. Well, JavaScript has records too, where it's just key value pair. Um, we have this concept of a game piece. We have our turned, we have our game status. So you notice here the big thing is like no basic types. And one day I will do like a whole series on like avoiding basic types, right? Because like they don't give you any info
Yeah.
when you're going through code. Like if you think, oh, this function takes a string, I'm like, well, I don't know what that's supposed to be. Or if it takes an int, it's like, well, I don't know what that's supposed to be. Because those words don't have like context, or they have like infinite context, right?
Yeah.
And also, the problem with strings is there's so many ways. Like there's literally infinite strings that could be generated, but it's very unlikely that your application can handle like an infinite type of string.
Yeah.
So it's like there's two ways we deal with this, right? One is writing tests that sort of like and doing a lot of defensive coding, but a second way is making types
Mm-hmm.
and having your functions take types to represent exactly what they need. So like, no, I don't use strings for like my status message, right? Like the status message, okay, either there's no message or you might have seen this when you were playing. If you try and click a cell when it's not your turn, this is the message that's triggered
Yeah.
at the last possible moment before it's rendered on the screen, then it becomes a string. But internally in the application, it's a type, right? So I can type check against it, I can use case statements against it, and the compiler can warn me if I haven't addressed it.
Yeah. And just
So that's that.
yeah,
Mhm.
no, the thing I was gonna bring up for folks who haven't done TypeScript or say Elm or PureScript or all these things, all these types and stuff that you see here, they're I know this is obvious to you, Kirk, but when your program is running like this is a web-based game. When it's running, all these types like chosen piece, none of that is in the source code that gets compiled. Think of JavaScript as kind of like the binary of Elm to some degree. So
Yeah.
this is the types help, like you said, for discoverability for like a developer experience. It makes things really clear and concise in the code, but at the end of the day, this is just because we're humans and we don't want to mess things up.
Hmm.
But once it's all compiled down, none of this I mean, you have, I don't know if Elm has source maps, but source maps, yes, you when you're debugging, you could see these things potentially. You can do that in TypeScript or like Babel compiled code, but I don't know about Elm. But
I don't think MS, but don't quote me on that because I'm not like the expert, especially at the internals. What I can say is like, so with TypeScript, when you change it to JavaScript, what you end up with is, I mean, they're pretty comparable. Like it's very much readable JavaScript. TypeScript really tries to keep its promise to be sort of like a superset. Elm does not. Elm compiles down to very, very much optimized JavaScript code. It's pretty fast. Benchmarks are a very tricky topic,
yeah,
and so I won't like I don't like to tout that too much, but I will say like Elm derived JavaScript is as performant as the major libraries. So that's definitely like I don't know, like that's a draw that a lot of people also like. Like Elm tends to produce, and I think that's sort of it was interesting because for a time people thought functional languages were very slow because they had all these types and it's like, oh, it takes so long. But once people realize like, oh, we don't have to interpret this, we can always compile it to something else,
yeah,
that opened up a lot of possibilities. So like it's so high level that you can make very, very, very strong optimization. Like TypeScript at the end of the day, TypeScript is just like it like a layer over JavaScript. So you end up like your TypeScript ends up being very close to JavaScript. Elm can take much more things at Liberty. So it's pretty fast, which I appreciate. Haskell does a similar thing too. Haskell pretty much compiles down to just like bare naked like C code. So Haskell ends up being like super fast. So that's always fun. So you get all the safety while you're developing, and then the performance in the actual code execution.
yeah. Having said that, having worked in like C sharp or TypeScript, there is a penalty in terms of compile time. Like, yes, that is time
Hmm.
that you have to wait, but the
Yep.
compilers keep getting faster and faster. I know, like at least in I haven't worked with C sharp since like 2016, but I know TypeScript, which was also created by the same creator of C Sharp.
Yep.
They've been doing all kinds of optimizations to the TypeScript compiler because there are certain scenarios where the compiler would get really slow. Um, Sometimes for folks who do a lot of TypeScript development in VS Code, you have to restart the TypeScript server sometimes and stuff. But I know they've been doing a lot of improvements there because the developer experience is important too. But also at the same time too, we're getting like faster machines, which is great. Like I
Yeah.
don't have one, but like the new Apple M1s apparently are like just it's just
I don't have it
it's just
either.
bonkers how fast they are apparently. So yeah, but
Yeah, so I mean it's definitely I've been impressed with the TypeScript compiler so far. The Elm one was notorious, I think. Well, it had a little bit in some of the earlier versions. There's a certain type of data structure if you got like sort of too much into the nested records that people would notice was a problem. But I think there's been some improvements recently and it's gotten really good. So that's been super fun. Um, yeah, so I mean, what I've been doing recently is just working a lot with TypeScript
yeah,
and sort of using a lot of the lessons I've learned from Elm to inform my TypeScript code. And I'm going to be sharing some of that. So on the 26th, when we do the lightning talks, I'm going to look at property-based testing,
okay,
fuzz testing, which is something I learned in Elm and I was using on this project for a while. Um, but I'm like refactoring all the tests, so like that's not happening right now.
okay,
And then I think hopefully in March I want to do like a session on like domain driven like design in TypeScript to like teach people like, okay, how do I sensibly introduce types into an application to make it more robust, to eliminate errors, to provide clarity. I know the .NET, like the Microsoft guys, are really big on like, don't write comments. The code is documentation. People, you should write comments. Comments are helpful, but yeah, if you can write code that's like very clear on what it does and have your comments be very much like the why versus not the how, that can be really helpful too.
yeah,
What I like about Elm is that like even going through this, just scanning the type system, like you get an idea of like what this application does. We haven't even gotten into the functions yet,
yeah,
but
yeah,
like okay, I can pretty much figure out what this is trying to do just based on like the types that I see, and that's really powerful when it comes to like how quickly can people dive in and start contributing.
yeah,
So I think over the course of Oktoberfest, I had about like 2 dozen people kind of just jump in, first time functional programming, first time with Elm, some people first time with web development, and they were able to just, like make meaningful contributions.
yeah.
Uh,
And it's
and that I think that's like super valuable.
yeah, and the types here they're written in pretty much plain English. I mean,
Yes.
assuming you understand English, like some like my somebody who's non-technical can come in here, even though they might not program this, but they might go looking at the code. Okay, the
Yeah.
chosen piece did a move. Okay, the active player, you know, it's yeah, it's super helpful, and the type aliases are definitely pretty powerful, even based whether it's off of primitive types or types you created.
Yes.
Like you were saying
Yes. I
about like number
definitely,
and stuff, like
as programmers, like we're always trying to get the max amount of context. Like, what am I doing in this space? There's a F sharp developer who's a good friend of mine, or like he's a really cool person who is also a friend of mine. I hope he's a good friend of mine. He's a great guy named Kit Eason, and he
you
talks
better be
about
Kit.
like Kit's great. Kit's genuinely awesome, and he's a really good teacher. And he sort of talks about he sort of defines like what is good code, and he splits into these different ways. And I'm not going to get the terminology right, but he talks about like lexical clarity. Like when I look at a piece of code, how well do I get what's going on? I don't need to know all the details, but like how quickly do I get the gist of what I'm looking at? And he says it's like when you're thinking about what makes code readable, that's really important, right? Like how quickly do people sort of get like, okay, the intent of the code that's going on.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something that's really powerful. Another F sharp developer named Scott Washington, really big domain driven development guy. He talks about one of the powerful things when you have a powerful type system like Elm or TypeScript or F sharp is that you can work with non-technical people and you can both speak the same language of this domain. Like you said, like none of this, the word function doesn't exist here.
Yeah.
There's no like big int, booleans, right? We're just saying exactly what things are. And you can take this to a PM or a client or a product owner and be like, okay, does this map your processes? And they'll either give you like, no, well, actually this does this. And you can really, really fine tune it. Like this game status. This is one thing I think TypeScript doesn't exactly have, or it takes a little more setup to do, these sort of like abstract data types, like a union type with also like a bunch more extra context. You can still do it, but it's a little tricky. But like, okay, when the game is in play, there's an active player and it has to be some type of turn.
Okay.
When the game is won, that's all gone, right? Like, so you're not keeping track of things with Booleans, like, oh, is this enabled or disabled or like true or false or like null or initialized? Like, I don't. And in general, I want to like those are what I consider a little bit of an anti-pattern in your model. If you have like if something's null or not, like if it's null or not, or like true or false means like there's two states, and instead of calling one thing true or false, you could probably have like more semantic names, like okay, well either this is happening, or if it's not happening, you can just not have it in that phase of the model, right?
Yeah.
So if you think of your model as like transitions between different valid states, you can be very specific. So while your application is loading, you don't need to have like username null. You could just not have a username variable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you can never get into the situation of an invalid username in the wrong place because it just cannot exist by definition. Richard Feldman has a really great talk called "Make Impossible States Impossible" that really kind of like gets into this idea. I have been talking a lot. I'm sorry.
Oh no, that's okay. I'm just grabbing that link. Uh, oh, can't see Dodge shows it, but here's the video. I'll post it in the chat here. Just one sec. Yeah, no, it makes it, that made me think of, well, there's a couple things. I David Khurshid, who's David K Piano on Twitter, he's big into state machines, and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like you were mentioning that just can't happen with a state machine. I'm by
Yes.
no means super well versed in state machines. I attended his front end master's course, and it was really interesting, and I definitely want to dig into that. But when you were talking about the different states before there, it made me think of like in 2016 when I was using TypeScript as well. Uh, there was the question of, can a boolean be undefined, so then it's essentially three states instead of two, and like we had a big
Yeah.
debate in like, well, it's not set yet because they haven't done anything, but and then it's not the same thing as false, right? But
No.
and I think, can't remember when union and intersection types came out, because I've been using TypeScript since 2015, so like version 1.2 I think was the first version I used.
Okay. So like you were there pretty early because TypeScript was also I feel like around 2012 was when it sort of like started to appear,
Yeah.
and then it's been steadily sort of sorry trying to it's been and now it's just like it's here, right?
Yeah,
Like it's definitely like the thing.
it's kind of funny because I was working at a Microsoft based shop, so we used VS Code at the time. But for those nowadays, people are like, VS Code's awesome. I mean, we were using it because it was the only editor that really supported TypeScript at the time.
Yeah.
But there was a time in VS Code's existence that it did not have extensions. It did not have syncing any, like it was literally just the editor, and it worked with JavaScript and TypeScript, and that was pretty much it. So it's,
I love that.
I mean, I think it is logical to have extensions and all that stuff come on later because every editor needs those kind of things. But anyways,
VS Conf was like a week ago, and the keynote speaker was like, a lot of people think like VS Code like burst onto the scene and was like great from the get go. He's like, this took us like 10 years to build,
yeah, yeah.
you know? And I think they were thinking about like making it like purely browser based for a while, and then they changed their mind on that. That was a whole thing.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I know we're getting off the topic of Elm, and we'll definitely wrap
yes,
up soon because I got to cut out soon. But
yeah,
they bet on web technologies being forward thinking, I believe, because
hmm
VS Code, for those who aren't aware, it is an Electron app. So you can, it's all web based technologies inside. That's what makes the editor super easy to customize and when people build themes and stuff. Um,
yep,
but Microsoft owns GitHub now. There's something called Code Spaces on GitHub, which allows you to load a repository and just start working in the browser. And it's literally VS Code in the browser, and it's literally like instead of being an Electron, I'm in the actual browser now. And I have a feeling because Microsoft's been very cloud forward for quite a while now. I've
yeah.
you know, I'm guessing whenever they decided to make VS Code, they said, you know what, this is going to be in the cloud one day and it's going to be, in a browser. And I'm pretty sure that's, I'm sure there's a blog post or video about it, but I'm sure that somebody said, yeah, that's why we bet on web technologies. Cause, and
I've been using. I was gonna say I've been using code spaces for some of my work recently, and I'm like, oh, this is yeah, I can live here because I used to use like there's stuff like REPL IT. There's a couple like there's a lot of online IDEs, but code spaces seems like it's really trying to be no, I'm an editor. I'm almost I'm real, and I'm just like here, so I'm super excited about that.
yeah, so, uh,
Microsoft is not the company that they were like 20 years. I feel like a lot of people are stuck in like that Windows 98 idea of what Microsoft is, and that's like a very, very far removal from what they are right now, especially in like the world of open source. Like they really did a hard like, yeah, we're gonna do cross-platform all the way.
yeah, yeah,
We're gonna do like OSS all the way.
no, for sure.
Yeah,
And with that, I will make an awkward segue to say I think we're going to wrap up today, just
totally.
because it's probably not cool if I leave my daughter sitting alone outside of school. Um, Dan Ott's in the stream, and he said something in caps, and there's a bot moderator that deleted his messages. Just making me laugh. Um, uh,
I can't see chat at all, so I'm missing all this, and
Oh
I'm
yeah,
super
yeah,
sad.
yeah. You can see it in the browser if you load it up. But yeah, I just want to say it was a lot of fun just chatting. I know we didn't go deep, deep, deep into doing any coding, but I think it was kind of nice to just talk a bit about functional
Yeah,
programming, digging into like some of the goals of what Elm, like why Elm exists, giving a little rundown of how some of the code works, focusing more on the types and stuff and just how you're talking about like domain driven design and like how, types are for correctness, but also just really being able to explain, if things like we always say in programming, it's always hard naming things, but if you get it right, it definitely brings clarity to code bases, especially large code bases when you're trying to discover stuff. No, this was super fun. I really want to have you on again. I don't know when we'll do it next, maybe in the next couple weeks or something, but it'd be kind of fun to now that we've kind of gotten like a more of not theoretical stuff, but more like the gist of what Elm is to really dig into. I would say we dig into Quarto because that's what you've been working on in Elmland, and yeah, we'll go from there. Uh,
yeah.
oh,
This has been awesome.
yeah, no, thanks again, and I'm going to go and retrieve my daughter before she's there alone. So take care, everybody, and
All right,
yeah,
everybody.
we'll see you in a bit.